During World War II, the Nazis brought human suffering to unimaginable extremes. In camps like Auschwitz, prisoners were forced to perform forced labor until they collapsed, and many suffered extreme punishments, such as being submerged in freezing water for hours for experiments on hypothermia. Klaus Barbie, known as the Butcher of Lyon, used ruthless methods such as submerging his victims in freezing water or applying electric shocks to sensitive areas to obtain confessions. Figures like Josef Mengele conducted brutal medical experiments, such as amputating limbs without anesthesia or injecting substances into the eyes of children to attempt to change their color. In camps like Dachau, prisoners were used as test subjects for mustard gas, leaving open chemical wounds that were never treated. The Nazi horror was not limited to the concentration camps. Sophie Scholl, a young activist of the German resistance, was arrested along with her brother for distributing leaflets against the regime. After a summary trial, she was sentenced to death and guillotined at the age of 21. The beginning, the arrival at the concentration camps in Dachau. Originally conceived as prisons for German political prisoners aimed at housing revolutionaries of the communist cause, the concentration and extermination camps became, starting in 1933, Heinrich Himmler's sinister playground and experimentation site. The leader of the SS took control of the forced labor camp and gradually turned it into the largest machinery of extermination for Jews and communists in Europe. In 1933, Adolf Hitler assumed the position of Chancellor of Germany and used his power to begin shaping the German nation according to his own vision. Among the first steps taken by the Nazis, one would change the fate of humanity very early on. We are talking about the opening of the first concentration camp, Dachau, which was originally created with the idea of housing German political prisoners, mainly those linked to communist ideology. But it would become the model that Hitler would replicate to carry out the Holocaust. The camp was handed over to Heinrich Himmler, leader of the SS, who established the barracks and the training camp of this force within it, and also began using the complex as a center for the execution of political enemies. In a very short time, Dachau became a symbol of terror in Nazi Germany. Thousands of Jews, Romanians, and communists were sent there to manufacture ammunition for Hitler's army. It also became the main prison for German intellectuals, artists, and other people whom the regime considered dangerous to its ideology. So much so that German children created a chant that said, "Please God, make me stupid, please so that they don't send me to Dachau." The complex, designed by Commander Theodor Eicke, consisted of a central building that served as the offices of the High Command and supervisors, the barracks and the SS training camp, as well as the ammunition factories where the prisoners worked. There were also various spaces for punishing prisoners, with methods of torture or execution that we will detail later. Finally, a huge crematorium closed the fate of the victims of the relentless regime. Although in the early years, civil laws governed over this concentration camp, the prisoners at Dachau were treated very violently. Even before the massive arrival of Jews or the implementation of the final solution, German prisoners who were admitted to the camp on suspicion of communism, treason, or opposition to the regime were beaten by the SS guards, in some cases to death. As a munitions factory, production at Dachau had to be extreme, and one of the main motivators to optimize labor was fear. So Hitler, as Chancellor, decided to change the camp's legislation to allow supervisors to act as they saw fit. This way, torture and murder were no longer seen as crimes, and the soldiers had a free pass to treat prisoners with brutal sadism. For example, prisoners who broke any of the strict rules regarding the schedules they had to follow, the amount of production they had to achieve, or the places they were allowed to walk, would be beaten. Those who attempted to escape, or even conspired to plan an escape, would die on the spot with no right to a trial or defense. But it was in 1940 when Dachau became one of the most brutal concentration camps for Jews. It became one of the most overcrowded and sinister extermination centers in Nazi Germany. Although the complex was designed to hold 6,000 prisoners, its capacity was pushed to accommodate up to 30,000 people. Of course, this took a toll on the miserable quality of life for those who had to work in the camp under forced labor. From this point onward, punishments became everyday occurrences, including public humiliations such as flagellations with whips or barbed wire, leaving prisoners' backs raw. Many times, without any reason, officers would line up several people and shoot them in front of others while they were working, simply to remind them of what would happen if they fell behind or their productivity decreased. Personal cells were also used, where some prisoners had to live in small rooms where they could only stand without being able to sit, and would spend entire days this way until their bodies broke down. Thousands of Jews died from malnutrition, heart failure due to the efforts and diseases contracted from the poor sanitary conditions in which they lived. During Operation Barbarossa, around 4,000 prisoners of war were sent to Dachau and systematically killed. By 1944, Dachau was more than just an extermination center. Anyone sent there was unlikely to survive. Experiments were also conducted on the population, mainly on women and children. For example, it is known that the Nazis were interested in cryogenics, the possibility of reviving someone after they had died from freezing. To test this, hundreds of Jews were submerged daily in tanks filled with ice-cold water, where they died from hypothermia, the concentration camps, the horror from childhood to old age. Near the end of the war, Dachau received hundreds of prisoners every day. General conditions deteriorated even further, and in just a few months, 15,000 people died solely due to the inhuman conditions in which they lived. With the advance of the Allies through Europe, executions increased. By 1945, with enemy forces at the gates of Berlin, some commanders suggested to Himmler that Dachau be handed over to the Americans. But he refused. His response was, "We must not allow a single one of our prisoners to fall alive into the hands of our enemies." Of course, this was because Himmler knew that the terrible crimes they had committed would bring terrible trials after the war. The concentration camps served different purposes and were truly part of the state terror network that included the courts, the police, the prisons, and the ghettos. The concentration camp was meant to eradicate those labeled as social, racial, and political enemies in order to create a uniform and healthy national community. This function progressively adopted different forms, constantly evolving and overlapping, such as forced labor, selective murder, human experimentation, and mass extermination. It should be clarified that, although the majority of the prisoners were Jewish, there were also gypsies, criminals, Jehovah's Witnesses, and homosexuals, among others. Once confined there, they became captives and could not leave. Upon entering, they had to hand over their clothes and personal belongings. Immediately afterward, an officer shaved their heads and gave them the well-known striped uniform, along with a pair of wooden clogs. Once the access to the concentration camp was completed, what would become a life of true suffering began. Each concentration camp had its own methods and peculiarities, but there were a series of mechanisms that connected them. All the captives had to wake up early, make their beds, and after the initial roll call, they were forced to perform forced labor. Generally, these tasks consisted of working in agricultural farms, factories, industrial establishments, as well as repairing roads or cutting down forests, among others. One of the most popular factories where forced labor was used was the TOD organization, dedicated to civil and military engineering. There, Soviet prisoners of war worked for free for months or years. After a large number of hours, the concentration camp prisoners received their only daily meal, which usually consisted of a meager vegetable soup with a small piece of bread. One of the most feared moments for the prisoners was the roll calls they had to undergo both in the morning and in the afternoon. After performing forced labor, they were forced to stand for a large number of hours in extreme temperatures while the officers checked the presence of all captives. The case of Louis Ubrig is well known, as in 1939 he managed to escape from the Dachau camp. After his absence was discovered as a form of retaliation, all his companions had to remain standing in formation for an entire night and endure the most stormy cold. In addition, the SS officers used the roll calls to check who was physically fit to work, and those who did not meet the necessary conditions were executed. Regarding specific cases, there are countless chilling stories of victims who were face to face with harsh punishments from their captors. Among them is the case of the British prisoner Johanna Hill, who, due to the beatings received from the Gestapo, lost her ability to be a mother. Ludmila Kokrda, also born in Great Britain, was forced to work cleaning swamps in heavy rain. It is worth noting that to carry out this task, she only wore a cotton shirt and her diet consisted of beets, leaves, and potato peels. Another of the punishments the prisoners were subjected to were medical experiments. The most infamous executor of these tortures was Josef Mengele, known as the Angel of Death of the Auschwitz camp. Mengele subjected his victims to terrible experiences that no human would be willing to endure. Some of his practices included injecting liquid cement into the wombs of women or subjecting several individuals to boiling water baths to evaluate the maximum temperature they could tolerate, among other macabre procedures. According to Annette Cabelli, a survivor of the Auschwitz camp, they would take the young girls and remove all the organs they could. Then they would send them to work. But they couldn't, and a week later they would die. On the other hand, children also suffered horrific punishments in the camps. In Poland, within the city of Łódź, the Kinder KZ was built, a camp for infants and adolescents between the ages of 2 and 16. The boys were forced to perform laborious tasks, such as making items like straw shoes, wicker baskets, while the girls were responsible for tasks related to laundry, tailoring, and cooking. These activities were carried out in conditions of weakness and relentless hunger. Their breakfast consisted of a slice of bread and half a liter of coffee. Only at night did they receive a new food ration, which usually consisted of a potato soup with beetroot or cabbage. In any case, if they were punished for various behaviors, they were forbidden to eat for several days, which led them to death. The most infamous guard, Wilhelm Boger, the terrible machinery of death that were the Nazi extermination camps, could not function without the smooth operation of the guards. One such example was Edward August, a guard of the SS at the Kinder KZ, the camp for infants who, according to testimonies, was constantly drunk. He was omnipresent. He delighted in subjecting prisoners to the most imaginative tortures. He beat and kicked them in the most sensitive areas, buried them in sandboxes, immersed them in a barrel of water, hung them by their legs with a chain, submerged their heads in tanks with lubricants used for cars, cut their genitals with a knife, beat their heels, and extinguished cigarettes on the prisoners' chests. But not all of them were SS officers. There were different ranks within the brutal work at Auschwitz. Lower-ranking guards were Jews working for the Germans in exchange for some improvements in their miserable lifestyles, usually driven by terror, hunger, and desperation. Then there were the kapos, prisoners of German and Aryan origin who had been transferred from maximum security prisons to reign over the cells. Finally, there were the SS men, whose job was to carry out the systematic extermination of the Jewish people. In some cases, they also carried out the most brutal tortures, like the infamous Wilhelm Boger, who invented such a sinister practice that it became recorded in history, Boger's swing. There is probably no better example of what the German guards of Auschwitz were like than Wilhelm Boger. To present him, it is enough to quote the account of a Holocaust survivor, Dunia Wasserstrom. During a selection of prisoners for execution, Boger chose a 4 or 5-year-old child who had gotten off a truck and was holding an apple. He took the apple away, grabbed the child by the feet and slammed him with great force against a wall of the barracks, immediately killing the child. Then he walked away, eating the apple. The truck with the rest of the children was taken to the gas chamber. Wilhelm Boger joined the Nazi Party in 1929, but began his military career as an auxiliary police officer in 1933. At the same time, he entered the academy to train in the force. In 1936, he received complaints for mistreating suspects during interrogations, but this did not prevent him from being promoted to commissioner in 1937, after graduating from the academy. After spending some years working for the state police, Boger was sent to Auschwitz, where he worked as a second lieutenant in the political department, which was part of the Reich Security Office and was known as the Gestapo of the concentration camps. His main duties were to maintain order in the complex, organize the reception of prisoners, suppress uprisings, and conduct interrogations. However, Boger's character was so bloodthirsty that he earned the nickname the Tiger of Auschwitz. Boger carried out his tasks with the utmost cruelty, to the point that he designed a method of torture that terrified even his superiors. The Boger swing consisted of taking a long metal bar and placing it several meters off the ground on 2 wooden pillars. Then, a prisoner was taken and tied by their feet and hands behind their back, by the wrists and ankles, so that they hung upside down, with all the weight of their body pulling on their extremities. Boga would then hit the tortured prisoner with great force, creating a swinging motion that intensified the pain. Most victims would pass out from the process and remain hanging until they resumed the sinister activities. Normally, the torture continued until the victims became nothing more than bags of skin and bones and were taken to mass graves. Although Boga's superiors forbade this brutal practice, the Guard continued it in secret until the evacuation of Auschwitz. Boga was arrested in 1945, but went through the Allies' denazification process, which allowed him to remain free until 1956, when he was finally tried for his horrible crimes, thanks to testimonies from surviving Jews, along with dozens of his SS colleagues who carried out the same types of abuse on prisoners. The Lady of Death, Maria Mandel, the Beast of Auschwitz. There were many fears for the Jews imprisoned in the sinister Auschwitz-Birkenau concentration camp. Any act that deviated from the strict behavioral protocol imposed by the Nazis, essentially total submission, ended in torture and death. Simply taking an irregular step during the long marches between barracks or dropping a brass plate during the few breakfasts they had was grounds for punishment. But there was even a more terrifying stage, which was when any of these things happened under the watchful eye of Maria Mandel, the Beast of Auschwitz. A woman so brutal that her very presence was a cause for alarm among the prisoners, as just crossing her gaze could earn you the most unimaginably terrible death. The SS camp leader forged a terrible reputation, to the point that even her own subordinates whispered behind her back about her inhumanity. In front of Mandel, the Jewish women worked until exhaustion. They preferred to overstrain their tired bodies and die that very night in the cold barracks, rather than anger the beast. This is because Mandel took any sign of weakness as an act of rebellion and punished it with the harshest possible penalties. The old, the women and the children, no one was spared from the bloodthirsty militarism of the Nazi officer. Maria Mendel was born on January 10, 1912, in Münzkirchen, a small Austrian village. She was the daughter of a moderately wealthy family and had everything she could want, receiving a high level of education. Maria did not live through the horrors of World War I, as many Germans or Austrians who would follow Hitler to the end did. On the contrary, while these towns sank into one of the worst crises in their history, Maria attended secondary school at Bürgerschule, a center where young professionals in commerce and craftsmanship were trained. During this time, Maria enjoyed enormous popularity in the city, as she was a young woman of exceptional beauty, desired by boys and admired by her classmates. However, the fragile bubble of youthful prosperity in which Maria Mendel lived was about to burst. After graduating and trying to enter the workforce, she discovered that the world had changed. To work in Germany during the interwar period, it was necessary to have a permit from the National Socialist Party, which Maria was able to obtain. She worked with her father for a time, but her relationship with her mother became increasingly difficult, so she decided to leave her home. Maria suffered greatly from the eviction as she could not find stable work, and after 10 failures, she decided to turn once again to her family. In 1938, thanks to a family contact, Maria became a guard at the Lichtenberg internment center. Although she had been trained as a future commercial professional, she was not in a position to reject any opportunity. But this would be the fateful moment that sealed her destiny as the judge and executor of hundreds of thousands of souls. In less than a year, the number of prisoners at Lichtenberg grew so much that the Ravensbrück concentration camp, reserved for women, was built, and in 1939, Maria was sent there. At Ravensbrück, Mandel began her path of brutality, laying the first stones on which she would build her infamous reputation. Maria inspected the prisoners, turning a simple administrative process into a sinister game of resistance. She forced them to perform exercises, and if any fell or stopped due to exhaustion, she sent them to the bunker, a space where she executed terrible punishments, such as floggings or psychological humiliations. Over the years, she increased the violence of her methods, which would reach their peak of evil in 1942, when she was promoted to head of the SS camp and sent to Auschwitz. On October 7th, when she arrived at the massive prison, Maria discovered that she was above all the Jews and even the Nazis in the complex. She only had to report to Commander Rudolf Höss. In Auschwitz, Mengele saw a vast playground where she could unleash all her malice. The beast was about to be freed. Mengele drowned newborn babies in tubs of water in front of their mothers' eyes. She sent pregnant women to the crematoriums to be burned alive. She flogged women to death, whether they died from the blows or simply bled out. Maria had the habit of adopting Jewish prisoners as pets, forcing them to stay by her side or even participate in her macabre tortures, only to get bored and then turn her cruelty against them. Some claim she also had a secret affair with Dr. Josef Mengele and enjoyed taking part in the sinister experiments of her lover. About 500,000 people died directly or indirectly at the hands of Maria Mengele, who was known to all as the Beast of Auschwitz, and whose direct gaze was a sentence to the gas chamber. By the end of the war, Mengele was sent to Dachau, where she did not stay long after the fall of Berlin. Little is known about her time at the infamous complex, although it is known that she fled to Austria, her home country, before the Allies entered the concentration camp. However, 10 days after her arrival, she was captured by the Allies, who detained her for nearly a year before she was put on trial. In 1947, after a thorough trial, Maria Mengele was found guilty of the deaths of 500,000 people, including children, and sentenced to hang by the neck. In her final statement, the Beast of Auschwitz denied any responsibility for her actions. "I had neither a whip nor a dog. In fulfilling my service in Auschwitz, I was hindered by the terrible severity of Rudolf Höss. I depended entirely on the commander and could not impose any punishment." Despite invoking just following orders, her sentence was not overturned, and on January 24, 1948, Maria Mengele was hanged until she died. Her still young body, at 36 years old, hung lifeless, stripped of all the beauty that had made her famous in her youth, in front of the eyes of some surviving prisoners and relatives of her victims. The Bitch of Buchenwald, the brutal Ilse Koch. Unlike Maria Mengele, Ilse Koch didn't hold a hierarchical role within the SS, but rather enjoyed the privileges of being the wife of a high-ranking officer, Field Colonel Karl Koch, a woman who, by German standards, was considered very beautiful, reveled in wearing provocative clothing in front of the Jewish prisoners at the Buchenwald concentration camp, where she became known as the Bitch. Margaret Ilse Köhler was born on September 22, 1906 in Dresden, a small city in Saxony, Germany. The daughter of a middle-class family, she always showed a calm character, which in no way foreshadowed the profound violence she would spread as an adult. At the age of 15, she left school to work first in a factory and then in a bookstore as a saleswoman. Young Ilse developed great social skills, and together with her beauty, she became irresistible to the young men who visited the store. Little by little, she became known among the Nazi officers who involved her in political activity, to the point where she forged friendships with members of the SS. By 1932, Ilse was already a German femme fatale, with deep contacts within the National Socialist structure, and she used her influence to start working as a secretary in the party. The charming young woman continued to attract the attention of every man she crossed paths with until she met Heinrich Himmler himself, the Reichsführer of the SS. Although Himmler was married, he considered the exquisite Ilse to be an excellent match for a young Aryan, and he introduced her to Karl Koch, one of his most important assistants, who served as colonel at the Sachsenhausen camp. Whether Himmler played Cupid or exercised some pressure on his right-hand man, Karl and Ilse married in 1936, but it was in 1939 that the couple truly connected, thanks to the sinister atrocities they carried out together in the Buchenwald extermination camp. Although the Kochs already had children, after the obligatory period of dedication to fatherhood imposed by the Reich, they returned to the camp command with a renewed sense of cruelty. Karl was already a recognized sadist, known for his torture methods, but far from calming him, Ilse raised the stakes and the marriage plunged into a bloody frenzy of abuse. The Kochs became known for returning to the most brutal medieval torture methods. We are talking about branding prisoners with red-hot iron, crushing their limbs with hammers and whipping them with barbed wire or lashes with razor blades. But what awaited the prisoners at Villa Koch, the estate where the family lived in Buchenwald, was even worse. Ilse had become a woman drawn to perversity in various aspects. According to the Germans themselves, she organized orgies in her home, only to then feast on the tortures of the Jewish prisoners. Whether with her own people or strangers, Ilse Koch displayed an insatiable appetite for extreme emotions. To satisfy his wife's needs, Karl had a sort of pavilion built, a bunker of horror, where Ilse could carry out her events, whether sexual or bloody. The building was 40 meters wide and 100 meters long, housing several rooms equipped for torture or orgies. With furniture designed to cause unspeakable pain or mirrored rooms to have a 360-degree view of the feast, Ilse's House of Terror became the setting for the unleashed brutality of Nazism. In the morning, Ilse would take a walk around the estate fields, then visit the camp, where she delighted in whipping Jewish prisoners. Any reason would spark her violence, and her punishments in broad daylight became more brutal each day. One of her favorite activities was sending the dogs against the pregnant women to inflict terror and severe wounds on them. But the most macabre was her obsession with creating clothing and furniture using the skin of Holocaust victims. Ilse began requesting that Jews be skinned after she became interested in the tattoos of some prisoners. She wanted to keep the tattoos as a sort of sinister memento and used them to make lamps. But she didn't stop there. She also began creating accessories and even started to dissect heads and other body parts, hanging them in her home as if she were the infamous serial killer Ed Gein. After being captured alongside her husband at the end of the war, several witnesses testified that they had seen prisoner tattoos printed on the underwear that Ilse wore. It is believed she participated in more than 33,000 murders, though approximately 5,000 were carried out directly alongside her husband. Although she managed to evade justice despite the overwhelming evidence against her, in 1951 she was sentenced to life imprisonment for crimes far less severe than those she had committed. Ilse Koch decided to end her own life in 1967 by hanging herself in her prison cell with the help of a white sheet. Those who knew her at the end of her life claim that Ilse only spoke of being a sinner and that she did not deserve God's forgiveness. Perhaps this is true not only for Koch but for all the collaborators in the terrible massacre that took place in one of the most brutal moments in the history of humanity. The Death March, the final torture. The Death March is one of the most terrible methods of torture that humanity has practiced. It involves forcing a large group of people, usually slaves or prisoners, to march long distances over extended periods of time at a sustained pace without providing them with food or water. Those who fall are left behind on the path, facing certain death, while those who lag behind are typically executed by the guards who monitor the brutal caravan. Although this sinister method has been practiced since antiquity, mainly by Western slave traders in Africa, the last death marches were not actually that long ago, as they served as the final torture device for the Axis forces. The Germans at the end of World War II carried out large death marches with prisoners from concentration camps, while the Empire of Japan also organized their own with Indonesian slaves and Allied prisoners of war. These practices left tens of thousands dead and are considered the final war crime committed by these countries during the largest conflict Europe has ever seen. By the end of World War II, Germany was deeply weakened militarily, but Hitler's officers had a greater problem: the millions of prisoners locked in the grim concentration camps. The Nazis were very aware of what would happen if Germany were occupied, and the Allies found the brutal prisons, along with the torture chambers and systematic execution methods they had used, to carry out one of the largest genocides in history. Between 1944 and 1945, large-scale massacres were carried out mechanically to eliminate as many captives as possible. Despite the fact that the Jews, African Americans, and Roma imprisoned were in deplorable health due to malnutrition, overcrowding, and disease, the organized massacres aimed to conceal and erase the evidence of the atrocities carried out by the Third Reich. Thus, the death marches were organized, directed by the SS officers. These consisted of forcing prisoners to walk great distances for extended periods without food or water. It was expected that a large part of the group would die during the march, as most of these people were already on the brink of death. Those who fell were left behind, while those who lagged, complained, or could not continue were executed by the soldiers. After the first stretch, survivors were typically forced onto trains designed to carry livestock. Many people also died on these trips, as they were packed in until there was no room to breathe, and they were not provided with even the most basic conditions for survival. After nearly a week of traveling without food, water, or air, few would disembark from these sinister trains. Those who did had to endure another march toward a fateful destination, another concentration camp. Upon arrival, they would continue the horrific routine that had defined their lives over the past years, or they would face a firing squad. While this phenomenon can be traced back to the beginning of World War II, with the march from Chelm, when Polish men aged 16 to 60 were forced to evacuate on foot, most of the deaths occurred from executions along the way. It was from 1944 that the marches showed their cruelest and most inhuman side. The last gasp of Nazism, the failure of the marches. One of the first to be evacuated was the Polish camp of Majdanek. In the face of the advancing Soviet troops, the Nazis had to hurry the procedure, so about 1,000 prisoners were subjected to the march, while other thousands were trapped in the facilities. The German officers concentrated on destroying certain specific areas, such as the crematories and the extermination chambers, but this would be their last slip-up. As the Allies entered the territories occupied by Hitler's forces, the death marches became more prolific. This is the case of Mittelbau-Dora, a camp that was evacuated well before the arrival of the American troops. When the Allies arrived, only the dying and sick remained. In early 1945, one of the most sinister death marches of the Holocaust took place. As the Red Army advanced into the interior of Poland, the Nazis ordered the evacuation of one of the largest camps, Auschwitz. Between January 17th and 21st, SS officers took 56,000 prisoners, who were forced to march without rest, food, or water for over 60 kilometers, in temperatures below -20 degrees Celsius, dressed only in their prison clothes. Some managed to escape, assisted by civilians in the villages through which the fateful caravan passed. However, about 15,000 victims died along the way. The survivors were sent to other concentration camps by train. A few days later, 50,000 prisoners were evacuated from Stutthof in northern Poland to Lauenburg in eastern Germany. The journey was about 700 kilometers. At the start, the Germans led about 5,000 captives to the sea and shot them. The rest of the marchers were intercepted along the way by Soviet troops, so the Nazi officers forced them to return to the starting point. Although there is no exact number, thousands of people died during this march due to the harsh weather conditions, lack of basic supplies, and executions by the soldiers. Other camps began to be evacuated, and their prisoners were forced to march to other facilities, which would in turn be evacuated again with the same method. For example, in April 1945, about 28,000 prisoners marched from Buchenwald to Dachau, Flossenburg, and Theresienstadt, with the first being the destination for most of them. However, those who survived and made it to their destination did so only to face another sinister march. At the end of April, 15,000 people were sent from Dachau to the Austrian border. Only 6,000 reached their destination, while many of those left behind did not die immediately, but were later found by American troops scattered across the fields, dying of starvation or exhaustion. The truth is that despite many historical studies, the final objective of the death marches is not really known. While some claim that they were a Nazi strategy to erase the evidence of their crimes against humanity, this directly contradicts the fact that these particularly torturous procedures were well documented by their victims, by civilians who served as witnesses, by enemy soldiers, and even by the Nazi officers themselves, eaten up by guilt. Most of the concentration camps were not completely evacuated, and although some of the most sensitive rooms or facilities were destroyed so that the information wouldn't fall into the hands of the Allies, the practice of the death marches did nothing to help the members of the National Socialist Party, as they were still judged with the full weight of the law during the Nuremberg trials.